You guys criticize Peterson for not being able to integrate postmodernism and for being afraid of it. Now, I don't know what you're basing this on exactly. I mean, I saw his rants against postmodernism, and I think he might be triggered too easily. But could you give me like one specific example of what he's not specifically able to integrate? Because any aspect of postmodernism that Wilber has so far integrated into his model and has fleshed out as something that is an important contribution of postmodernism has been admitted by Peterson as well. I mean, Peterson has admitted that there is an indefinite number of possible interpretations to any occasion. He has openly admitted that. That's a postmodern idea. This is also what makes him sound like a bit like a social constructivist, by the way, because his theory of science is not a positivist one. But the only thing he insists on is that our narratives are restrained in many ways by reality. So even social construction, this is social reality, is not freely construed out of nothing, but even social construction is in touch with factors that are outside of mere subjective imagination. If you want to construe your social identity, you're not just free to go with any version of yourself that you want, but it has to fit your psychology, for example. It has to fit your personality. Otherwise you're inauthentic and you're forcing yourself into a picture that doesn't suit you. It has also to cohere with your biology. There are factors that are not simply up to you. You can't simply choose to change them. There are factors about yourself that are biological and that you have to take into account in your own picture. Your picture has to cover these. So our narratives are restrained by reality in all kinds of ways. In other words, our narratives are restrained in all the quadrants by realities that are outside our conscious construction and our conscious will. That's the only thing I see him saying when he's strongly criticizing postmodernism in this regard. Or the example with the lobsters. The only thing I see him saying there, it's not that we should organize societies following the role model of the lobsters. I don't think he's saying that. I think he only wants to show that hierarchies are so old, they are much older than social construction of reality is. Social construction of reality is a very, very young phenomenon. The very idea that you can socially construe your reality has as a precondition at least a former operational mind. And this is a very recent phenomenon. Lobsters, on the other hand, are not capable of former operational thought. At least in general, we assume they are not able to form concepts of the world. And yet they show behavior that is strictly hierarchical. And their behavior is also correlated with the way, with their ability to cope with challenges, with real life challenges in reality. In other words, what he wants to prove with the lobster example is that hierarchies don't only have an interior dimension, but they also have an outside dimension. In other words, they are in touch with reality. Hierarchies are in some way related to reality, responding to challenges of reality. And if they weren't, they wouldn't have been passed down in evolution. I think this is the basic idea that he's giving. And of course he goes then even further to argue that our mind in the end is organized hierarchically. Our way of perceiving the world has a hierarchical structure, and therefore it's not a coincidence that we build our organizations following the scheme or following the prime example that our mind gives to ourselves. We build our machines, we build our social machines to correspond to the structure of our own minds. So here again, I don't see him saying anything particularly radical. He's not saying that competence hierarchies are pure competence hierarchies. Of course, power plays a role in allocating the different positions within a hierarchy. But the only point he's making is that hierarchies have, to some degree, also something to do with competence. This is your ability to conquer world, your ability to understand the world. Not a very radical point. Partly postmodern, since there is social construction of hierarchies, but partly he admits that hierarchies are also influenced, again, just as your self-conception is, by factors which lie outside your own consciousness. So I would be really curious to see any kind of example where he is strictly rejecting postmodern ideas that are worthy of integration. I can't remember the other examples, but it's pretty much word to word. Everything that he says everything positive he says about postmodernism is word to word the same thing that Wilber said about the positive aspects of postmodernism. Yeah, he's aware of aperspectivism. He's aware that you can take different perspectives on phenomena. He's aware of the social sciences and of psychology being dealing with the left quadrants. He's aware of the left quadrant, so he's not a right quadrant absolutist, but he's also insisting that the right quadrants contribute to the bigger picture of what it is like to be a functioning personality. His reaction to postmodernism, in part, by the way, I think is so harsh because postmodernism is not postmodern, and this is something that integral theory has not been dealing enough with. I mean, Kant has made the point that there is something like regressive green, or quoting Majid Nawaz, as he did in one of his recent interviews with Corey, the regressive left. The issue is that I think Peterson is largely regarding postmodernism as a movement that is not truly post-formal and post-rational, or at the verge of becoming post-rational and aperspectival, in Gebser's words. I think in his interpretation, postmodernism is largely a pre-conventional thought system that is using terms that are conveying to be post-conventional. So he regards postmodernism as a largely regressive movement. In other words, the students that are immediately surrounding him and the academics that are surrounding him, I think he sees as largely having pre-rational thought systems that they live through a post-formal conceptual scheme. He says literally that it is one thing to have a good idea, but yet another thing to make the idea your own, to own the idea, to fully grasp it, fully understand it. Notice that postmodernism as a conceptual system and as a language game is available to everyone. Everyone can learn to use the language game correctly. And this is what students do, by the way. They learn when it's appropriate to say what, using the postmodern conceptual language game. But this doesn't mean that they necessarily understand it. I mean, it's absurd to have students who have been studying postmodernism for 2 weeks and insist they are postmodern already. I think it really takes a lot of time. And first you must become truly modern in the sense you must become self-aware. You must become aware of your own consciousness to then make the move into a-perspectivism. And from my experience, and I think this is Peterson's experience as well, most of those who are using the lingo are not, in Gebser's way, a-perspectival. They have not become transparent to themselves, but they're using the terms as empty shells. They're using terms such as consciousness, not to fully grasp a first-person reality. And they're in general not able of structuralist thought. This is to say, they can't see structures behind the various phenomena that they are describing. This is at least my impression when I'm reading postmodern literature in general. I don't see anything like the structuralism of a Jean Gebser in most of the postmodern literature. So the assessment might be wrong. Maybe postmodernism is largely truly postmodern. I don't know. I haven't seen data on this, but I'm pretty sure Peterson's impression is very different. Peterson's impression is that it is a conceptual system that is attractive to students for very pre-rational reasons. For example, you can sound very smart without having to study classics, since there is no real classical literature. There are no classics. Anything goes. If this is something that attracts you about postmodernism, you might rethink it, whether this is a really post-rational motif that you find attractive here. The reasons that many students find postmodernism interesting, I think, in general, are largely pre-rational and simply making things easy to them. It is the ultimative grand narrative. This is postmodernism, which can actually unhinge pretty much any other specific view. You can be a specialist on whatever topic. It doesn't matter, because you will always be unhinged by someone who radically doubts the possibility of knowledge, which is also a major feature of postmodernism as it is being expressed and as it is being lived by most of its proponents. So the radical skeptical position is really effective against pretty much any kind of professionalism, any kind of competence out there. It radically calls into question the very possibility of knowledge and reasoning. It calls even the possibility into question to know what to truly think, to become self-transparent. This is in any case not a post-formal interpretation of postmodernism. However, I think it's important to make the distinction. It's important to be thoughtful and to think whether postmodernism as a phenomenon is a truly green phenomenon, or whether it's not largely motivated by Ambler and largely pre-rational motifs. Again, in any case, I think this is Peterson's estimation of postmodernism, and wherever he finds a valid idea, the ideas I think he has incorporated into his bigger picture. At least I couldn't think of one single example where he wasn't successful.